To create the sprite graphics that we need to have an animated sprite in our code-based projects, we will be using Adobe Animate. Inside Adobe Animate, when I say I want to create a new file, the type of file that we will use is an ActionScript 3.0 file. This is a more stable format. The Canvas and WebGL are still a little quirky at times. So using the ActionScript 3 is a better option still at the moment because we are just creating frames of artwork. The size of our document when we create it will help us determine the size of our finished artwork, and we can make it whatever size that you want. A common option is to use then multiples of 2 factorial. So we commonly see sprite size 32, 64, 128 as our size options. The computer is happy when it's parsing pixel images of those dimensions. So if I make my artwork 64 by 64, and we do know that inside of processing it will be animating at 60 frames per second. So we can set that now as we create a document. After I've created a document, it looks like that. That's the area where I will create my sprite. Currently we are doing rectangle or square sprites because we are doing box collision with this, and because we will be working with it as rectangles, you will want your artwork to mostly fill the space to help out with doing those collisions. If you make artwork that is a triangle, you'll have the corners where the artwork is then not touching, because we are not going to be analyzing the pixel information of object 1 to object 2 to say, hey, are those pixels colliding? We will just be going with the bounding area of the image file itself. So the more you can fill up that image, square or rectangle that you create, the better your collision detection will work. Now, my favorite tool when working in Animate is using the brush as my content creation tool. So I can now click and choose the brush off my toolbar. After I choose the brush, I can choose whatever color I want to paint with, and now I can paint with that color. If we look down at the bottom down here on my screen, we will see there is a rectangle. Inside that rectangle is a little dot. That represents one frame of content. The black dot represents that this is a keyframe that has content in it. Now, each one of these rectangles represents a part of time. 60 of these is 1 second. So if I wanted to create a 60 frame animation, it would play back in the time of 1 second. So the animations that we create are going to play fairly quick when we bring them back into processing and play them inside of our code. If this is frame 1, when I go to frame 2, I can't do anything until I add an additional frame or keyframe to work with. Now, Animate describes in the timeline, frames are elements that are staying the same. Keyframes are where things are now changing. So if I want my artwork to change on the next frame, I need to insert an empty keyframe. And if we go to the Insert pull-down menu, Timeline, I will see that I have frame, keyframe, and blank keyframe as options. Frame is designated by the F5 function key. Keyframe, it should say F6 here, but it doesn't, and blank keyframe should say F7, but it doesn't. So if you like to use the keyboard shortcuts, which is what I will recommend, F6 will then add in a keyframe, F7 a blank keyframe. So now if I look at my artwork here and hit F7, I will see that it is now added in a blank keyframe. That blank keyframe has no content in it. It is empty. If I go to frame 2, we can see it is empty inside my artwork. So if I draw with my brush, I get something different. So I have frame 1, frame 2. When our artwork is this small, it's useful to zoom in. I can zoom in by clicking up here, or I can use the keyboard shortcuts that we use in all of our other Adobe programs of Command plus and Command minus as an option for zooming in. I'm just getting rid of fluff that I made there. Animation is simply change over time. To insert a new frame, F7, use my brush. Now, if we look here, I see I have 3 frames of artwork. Change over time. This isn't going to be very pretty animation, but it will help to get the point across. If I want to play my animation, I have controls down here at the bottom. I hit plus. We can see it plays almost too fast. If I modify my frame rate down to something much slower, then we can start to see it taking effect. So I put the frame rate at 12. So what I'm really doing is, if this was at 60 frames per second, each one of these frames would need to be 5 boxes long. And we can make our frames longer by clicking on a frame and hitting F5 on the keyboard. That increases the exposure or time for that frame. It adds or inserts timeline frame, F5. So now when I do that, we can see it plays slower. And if my frame rate were back up to 60, now we can at least see something is happening inside our animation. Just like every other Adobe program, we also have layers, so we can add in layers and paint on those layers additional or new content. So if I grab a new brush color, pay attention to which layer is active, I can make a mark. Now if I go to an empty frame and hit F7, I can make a different mark. When we are animating, it's common to want to see what is happening on previous frames, and we use onion skinning for that option. This little button down at the bottom, it will turn on onion skinning, allow us to see previous frames. So if I hit F7, I can now draw artwork and if I turn off onion skinning, we can see how by grabbing the playback head I can scrub through or watch my animation. So right now I'm just doing scribble animation just to demonstrate some of the basic features of what is possible when we work in Adobe Animate. I've started a file over here with 2 layers. This is going to be the clover that is going to be trying to run away from my cow. So this clover, what I want to do is I want to, on each frame, I want to draw the clover body as it's scooting along the ground a little bit different. If I turn on onion skinning and now hit F7, it inserts an empty keyframe showing me what was there before, but I do need to reset my color. Now in my tools I have an eyedropper. The eyedropper allows me to go and grab that green color that I painted with on the first frame. And now I will click and go back to my brush tool. And now in this empty frame, I am going to modify my artwork. And then I will hit F7 once more. And modify the artwork. And then F7 again. And modify the artwork. Now if I turn off onion skinning and scrub it, we can see how it's changing. Now this creates a change, and what I want to do is to be able to reverse this animation. Now I could redraw the frames until I get back to the open stance, but I can also cheat. And if I select the frames over there, just do one at a time, and hold down the Option key, then I can drag, and it now cloned or created a copy of that frame. Now I'll go to this frame, hold down Option, drag. So now we can see that it creates an animation of coming together and then opening back up. That works well when I want something to change. We redraw on each frame. If I want something just to move, but I don't want to redraw it, and I just want to change the position of this head, I can now, instead of F7 for an empty keyframe, hit F6. I'm going to switch tools to my transform tool, and with the transform tool active, I am going to move this and rotate it just a little bit, and then I will hit F7 or F6 once more and rotate it again, and hit F6 once more, Gotta select all of it and rotate it some more. So if I look at my animation, we can see how it's dropping down. Now I will use the same trick of Option dragging my frame out, so we can see how it's now compressing and opening. Compresses and opens. What's left for me is to fill my plant area. Now, I am going to fill the plant area by selecting the Eyedropper tool, clicking on the lighter green, and now I can click inside that plant area and go to the previous frame, click, 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 click. So now we can see it creates a loop. If I turn on looping on my playback and hit play, we can see I have a very spastic plant. That's telling me that I am creating too much change over too little time. But I can remedy that by stretching time out by adding more frames. And we do that by selecting frames and hitting F5. Select frames, F5, select frames, F5, 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 F5. Now if I turn back on loop on my playback, let's see if that's any better. It's better, but I think we can still slow it down a little bit more. So I'm going to repeat the process of F5, 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 and sadly I can't highlight all the frames and hit F5 and then it doubles all of them. It doesn't do that. It's not that smart, unfortunately. But let's see now. I think that's a little bit better. If I zoom out to 100%, okay, so now I have my clover that's going to be running from my cow. To get our sprite images out of Animate and to make them usable, what we need to do is we need to go under File and choose Export. and we'll choose export movie. And we will export our movie not as a movie file, but as a PNG sequence. And the reason that we are using PNG versus the other options is PNG allows us to have a transparent background on our artwork. And that is important. GIF sequence would work. JPEG does not allow for transparent background, and a SWF file won't be usable for what we're doing. So we want the PNG sequence. I'm going to find my project folder. We save our images always in our data folder. And now I can hit save. The next window that comes up, we have an option for choosing our image area. We can see my artwork in a few places must have extended beyond, because at this point it's showing a width of 65 and height of 66 if I'd say give me every pixel of my drawing. But if I want it to be confined to the 64 by 64 so it crops off those stray pixels off the edges, that's okay. And then I'll hit export. Now I will repeat that process with my cow. Again, file, export, movie. And we can see, look at all of those Clover images, all 19 of them. Now my cow is going to go in the same place. I will do it as document size, so it's 64, and hit export. Now the 32 is what gives us the transparent background. If we don't have 32, we don't get a transparent background. So keep that in mind. And then export. And now that part of the process is done. The next thing I get to do is incorporate these image files into my code.